But what I do balk at is the common strain of online memeing that Friends, this behemoth comedy, was not funny. To which I have nothing to say, but
Oh my God.
in fact, the 90s were a golden age of multicam sitcoms, with shows like Friends, Seinfeld, and Frasier dominating not just airtime, but mindshare, becoming part of the cultural framework of the era and establishing traditions and tropes that endure to this day. So, on some level, it's no surprise that newcomers to these shows, read haters, don't see how innovative and groundbreaking these hilarious shows were. Those who came up after them grew up on media that was influenced by these shows that built on the formula that they pioneered, so that, in hindsight, even these groundbreaking comedies can seem stale. This is a well-known phenomenon and is actually given the TV Tropes appellation of the Seinfeld isn't funny phenomenon.
Not that there's anything wrong with that.